The morning they came, to value the library. Cecily Ashford counted the books on the shelf beside the door, and thought that she would grieve them most of all. Not the silver candlesticks, which had belonged to her mother and which Mr. Cangery, Price's man, had already noted in his ledger with the detached efficiency of a physician recording a pulse. Not the escritoire in the morning room, where her father had written 100 letters, or the pair of paintings in the gallery that had watched over the house since before any of them were born. The books, 43 volumes, their spines soft from decades of handling, their pages marked in her father's hand, with notations she had memorized without meaning to. Those she would grieve. Miss Ashford, Mr. Price's man, a thin person named Tolly, who wore gray as though he had been born in it, paused at the threshold. The smaller drawing room, if you please. Mr. Price wishes to conduct the survey from the east wing forward. She set down the volume she had been holding. A volume of sermons her father had annotated so heavily, the margins had no white left in them, and followed Tolly without a word. The corridor was cold. Keld Manor in November was always cold, a particular bone-deep chill that no fire in the world entirely defeated, but today it felt deliberate, as though the house itself understood what the ledger men were doing and had withdrawn its warmth in protest. She passed the portrait of her late father, Thomas Ashford, and the portrait of her late uncle, Gerald Ashford, and at the end of the corridor, the portrait that always caught her eye, even when she did not mean to look at it. A young man of perhaps 22, painted in three-quarter view, with dark auburn hair and a steady, slightly resistant expression, as though the painter had asked him to look pleasant, and he had declined. She had never met the man in the portrait. She had been 7 years old when he left. The house had 3 rooms now devoted entirely to Sir Gerald's creditors, and a 4th set aside for Mr. Keed. Price himself, the senior agent of the firm of Price and Holt, appointed by the heir presumptive to catalogue the Ashford estate and render a proper accounting of what was owed and what remained. The heir presumptive was Sir Gerald's legitimate son, Bertram Ashford, who lived in Bath and had declined to make the journey to Keld. He had sent Price instead with a letter that Cecily had read twice and then placed very carefully in the drawer beneath the household accounts, as far from her hands as she could put it without actually burning it. The letter had referred to her as the steward's dependent. She was 24 years old. She had managed Keld Manor for 3 years, since her father's health had declined to the point where climbing the stairs twice in a day exhausted him. She had managed the tenants, the household accounts, the correspondence with the solicitor in Harrogate, the repair of the mill house after the spring flood, and the quiet negotiation with 2 local families, who had fallen behind on their rents and needed time they could not ask for directly. Her father had called her the truest steward the house had ever had. Bertram Ashford, whom she had met exactly twice, and found both times to be a man who wore his opinion of lesser persons in the set of his jaw, called her the steward's dependent. She was not the steward's dependent. She was the steward's daughter. There was a difference, even if Bertram did not see it. Her father had died in September. The baronet himself had died the following month, and with him any portion of the arrangements that might have provided for Cecily's remaining at Keld. The house passed to Bertram. The debts, which were considerable, passed with it. And so the men with ledgers had arrived, and with them the quiet machinery of an estate being assessed, and in all probability, sold. She sat with Mr. Brost, Price that afternoon in the east drawing-room and listened to him read aloud from the catalogue. Her hands were folded in her lap. She had learned sometime in the autumn how to listen to alarming information with her hands folded in her lap. It kept her from pressing them together, which was the thing she most wanted to do. The principal debt, Price was saying, consulting his ledger, stands at £9,400. Interest has accrued at the customary rate since the date of the last instrument, which was drawn in the spring of 1811. The assets of the estate, as currently assessed, represent approximately £12,000 in combined value, of which the house and grounds account for the greater portion. Sir Bertram's instructions are to liquidate sufficient assets to satisfy the principal and the accumulated interest, which sum together to £11,000, and change. The remainder, if any, will be held in trust. And the tenants. Cecily said. Price looked up from his ledger. He was a careful man, she had decided, not an unkind one. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had delivered this kind of news before and had learned to do it without flinching. The tenancies will be reviewed by Sir Bertram upon his assuming formal management of the property, he said. I cannot speak to his intentions, which meant, she understood, that the tenants had no more security than she did. She had thought, in the weeks since her father died, that grief operated in stages rather as a river does, moving between stretches of calm water and sudden drops where the current becomes something else entirely. She had managed the calm stretches with some competence. It was the drops that continued to surprise her. She excused herself before the drop arrived. The library was empty when she reached it, the ledger men having moved on to the silver room. She pressed her hand flat against the nearest shelf and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, listening to the house around her, the tick of the clock in the corridor, the wind against the north-facing windows, the distant clatter from the kitchen where Mrs. Clatter. Holt, the housekeeper, was directing the preparation of an afternoon meal that Cecily would probably not eat. She did not hear the door. She heard instead the stillness that replaced the sound of the door opening, the way a room changes its quality when a second person enters it. The pressure of another presence that she felt before she understood what it was. She opened her eyes. The man standing in the doorway of the library was not Tully, and not Price, and not any of the other gray-coated men who had been moving through Keld's rooms since Monday. He was tall, with the kind of breadth through the shoulders that comes from physical labor rather than fashionable coat-padding. And he wore that labor in the ease of his posture, the flat, unhurried way he occupied the doorway, as though he had not decided yet whether to enter. His coat was dark blue, well cut but not recently pressed. His hair, dark auburn, going to brown at the temples, was cropped close and slightly disordered from what she assumed was a long ride. He was perhaps 35, perhaps a year or two older, with a face that had been once sharply handsome and was now something more austere, the angles deepened by weather or by time, or by something she could not name from across the room. He was looking at her with an expression she could not read at all. "I beg your pardon," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "This room is not part of Mr. Price's survey at present. If you would direct yourself to the east wing." The man did not move. His eyes had not moved from her face. "You are not," he said, "who I expected to find here." His voice was low, level, the kind of voice that had learned not to carry more weight than the words required. Something in it snagged at her memory, and then released, without identifying itself. "I am Miss Ashford," she said, "and you are—" The pause that followed was brief, but she felt it. "Caro," he said. "Stephen Caro." If that name meant something specific to her at that moment, she could not have said why. It pressed against the edge of her understanding and then stepped back. She noted, without knowing why she noted it, that he had given her only a surname, no title, no connection. She noted that his eyes, dark gray in the November light, had not left her face since he entered. She noted that the portrait at the end of the corridor had the same slight resistance about the jaw, the same quality of a man choosing carefully what he showed and what he withheld. She would not connect those things for another 4 days. The house filled slowly with the kind of organized disorder that precedes a sale. Men came and went. Items were catalogued, assessed, argued over in the small increments of pound and shilling that represented the difference between adequacy and ruin. Cicely moved through it all with the household accounts book under one arm and a growing list of practical concerns that no one in Price's party seemed inclined to address. The tenants were the most pressing. Keld had 7 tenant families, and 6 of them had been on the land for at least 2 generations. The Worralls in the North Field, the Petch family at the Mill Cottage, old Mrs. Danforth, who was 81, and had lived her entire life in the same 2-room dwelling at the eastern edge of the estate. None of them knew officially that the estate was being assessed for sale. Cecily knew, and the knowledge sat in her chest like a stone she could not put down. she encountered Mr. Caro again on the second morning, in the kitchen garden. He was standing at the low stone wall that separated the garden from the orchard, his back to her, looking out at the rows of bare apple trees with an attention that seemed too concentrated to be casual. His coat collar was turned up against the cold. He did not hear her come through the garden gate. The orchard was replanted in 1804, she said. If the catalog men have not noted the trees separately from the land, they should. The yield this past autumn was the best in a decade. He turned, whatever had been on his face before she spoke. He had composed it by the time he faced her. "Were you the one who oversaw the replanting?" he said. "I was 11 years old in 1804. My father oversaw it." She paused. "I have managed the estate accounts for the past 3 years. I am aware of what Keld produces and what it owes." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite recognition. Not quite surprise. "What do you intend to do," he said, "when the sale is complete?" It was not, she thought, an impertinent question. It was asked without the condescension of someone who expected a helpless answer. It was asked the way one asks a question when one genuinely does not know the answer and wants to. "I intend," she said, "to ensure that the Petch family has adequate notice before the mill cottage changes hands, and that Mrs. Danforth's situation is secured in whatever instrument governs the sale after. That I have not yet decided." He held her gaze for a moment longer than the conversation required. "The mill cottage," he said quietly, "is not part of the entailed property." She stared at him. "What did you say?" The mill cottage was built on a parcel that was excluded from the original entail when the estate was settled in 1783. It passes to the surviving family, not to the heir presumptive. He said it carefully, as though he had checked the fact multiple times before offering it. "Price may not have accounted for it. You should raise the matter with him directly." She stood very still. The information was precise and specific, and not the kind of thing a ledgerman's assistant would carry in his head. "How do you know that?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. His hands, she noticed, were clasped behind his back with a care that suggested he was thinking about what they might otherwise do. "I have some familiarity with the estate's history," he said, and did not offer anything more. She raised the matter with Price that afternoon. Price consulted his copy of the settlement, and Price's expression underwent several adjustments before arriving at a careful neutrality. The mill cottage was, as Caro had stated, excluded from the entailed property. Mrs. Petch and her children had the right to remain. Cecily sat with this information for one evening and then went looking for Caro. She found him in the library. He was standing at the shelves near the window, not taking books down, simply looking at them the way she had looked at them that first morning, with the flat attention of someone reading something the books themselves had not printed. His back was to her again. She had a sudden conviction that he was not unaware of her presence, only giving her the choice of announcing herself or not. "My father annotated the sermons," she said. The volume on the third shelf from the top, on the right side of the bay. He filled every margin. Caro did not turn, but his chin lifted slightly. "I know," he said. "I watched him do it." She crossed the room and came to stand beside him. Not close, not the proper distance of strangers. "Something in between. You are not from Price's firm," she said. "No, you are not one of the men Sir Bertram sent." A pause, brief but complete. "No." She looked at the shelves, at the row of books he had been counting the day he arrived, and let the silence sit between them for a moment. "The portrait at the end of the corridor," she said. "It is a bad likeness." She heard his breath change. Not dramatically, not the gasp of a man caught out, but the small adjustment of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been asked, gently, to set it down. "It was painted in 1797, he said. "I was 21. I was considerably more hopeful then." She had been 7 years old when the younger Ashford son, Stephen, had been informed by his father that the arrangements surrounding his mother's marriage had been irregular in ways that could not now be corrected, that his legitimacy was, in legal terms, a matter of some question, and that it would be better for everyone if he removed himself from Keld and did not return. She had been 7, and had not understood what any of it meant. She had understood only that the young man whose horse she had occasionally watched from the nursery window was gone, and that no one spoke of him afterward, 21 years old and asked to disappear. She had thought of him sometimes in the abstract way one thinks of a family story that has become too old to feel like loss. She had not thought of him as a person who had continued to exist somewhere, who had grown older and learned things about millhouse parcels and entail settlements, who might one day come back to stand in this library, looking at a row of books he had watched an old man annotate in his youth. "You came back," she said. It was not an accusation. It was not even a question. Bertram appointed Price to manage the assessment. He said Price needed someone with knowledge of the local property records. "I have spent," he paused, "some years acquiring that knowledge." She understood this, the full, precise weight of it, in a single, long moment. He had come back as the instrument of the very assessment that would strip the estate of everything. He had come back holding the ledger, serving the heir who had benefited from his expulsion, walking these corridors with a catalogue in his hands, and a grief he had had 21 years to learn to carry without showing. "Does Price know who you are?" she said. "Price knows me as a land agent with experience in Yorkshire estates. Nothing more. Does Bertram know?" "Bertram would not recognize me if I handed him a card with my name on it. He was 4 years old when I left." She turned to look at him. Then full on, without the sideways pretense that the conversation demanded something other than direct attention. He had turned to look at her at the same moment, and the space between them, which had been the careful distance of propriety, felt suddenly very specific. His eyes, she decided, were not dark gray. In the candlelight of the library they were closer to the color of pewter at dusk, that particular deep silver that is neither blue nor gray, but has the quality of both. She thought that he was not cold. He had learned to look cold, which was a different thing. She thought that he had come back carrying a ledger, and was using it to protect the people he could not protect before. She thought these things in the space of 3 seconds, and then said carefully, "You should know that I intend to write to Sir Bertram directly about the terms of Mrs. Danforth's occupancy." "You should know," he said just as carefully, "that there is a second parcel excluded from the entail. The south kitchen garden, which was gifted separately to the housekeeper's family when the estate was settled, Mrs. Holt does not know." She stared at him. "You are a very unusual debt collector," she said. Something crossed his face too quickly to name and was gone. "Eat something?" he said. "You have not. Today. I noticed." She opened her mouth, closed it, and then, because there was nothing else to say, went to find Mrs. Holt and tell her about the south kitchen garden. If you have ever watched someone carry something heavy for a very long time and then refuse, out of pride or caution, to let anyone help, you will understand what the next days at Keld were like. Stay with it. The household had begun quietly to notice Mr. Caro. It was not that he was obvious about the things he did. He did not make proclamations. He did not insert himself into Price's meetings in any visible way. He submitted his assessments, walked the property lines, reviewed the relevant instruments with the careful efficiency of a man who understood the work. He ate the meals Mrs. Holt sent to the agent's dining room, and said little during them. He retired early, and was up before the kitchen fires were lit. Cecily knew he was up before the fires were lit because she was also up before the fires were lit, and she had found him twice in the early morning, once in the library with a survey map spread across the table, and once in the corridor outside her father's study with his hand flat against the door and his eyes closed. When an attitude she recognized, because she had adopted it herself more than once in the weeks since September. The second time she simply passed him without speaking, and went down to the kitchen to heat water for tea, and when she returned, he was gone. She had found in the weeks of grieving her father that some of the most useful things a person could do in the presence of someone else's grief was simply not to remark on it. She had wished, many times, that more people understood this. Caro seemed to understand it. He did not speak of her loss. did not offer the consoling phrases that she had collected by the dozen since September, and which had begun to feel, through no fault of the people who offered them, like smooth stones pressed into her hand when what she needed was solid ground. He spoke of practical matters and asked practical questions, and in between those practical moments, let silence exist without trying to fill it. On the fourth day after her conversation with him in the library, he knocked on the open door of the morning room where she was working through the household accounts and said, "I need to show you something." She followed him to the estate office, where the survey maps were spread across the large table, weighted at the corners with old account books. "Here," he said, and put his finger on a section of the northern boundary. The original deed of gift for the Warall family's holding was made in 1762. It was recorded in the county register in Harrogate, but the copy held at Keld was damaged in the 1798 flood. Bertram's solicitor will have worked from the estate copy, not the Harrogate original. She looked at the map. Had the finger pressed against the northern boundary, at the quiet steadiness of the hand it was attached to. "The county record shows a larger holding than the estate copy recorded," she said, "by 14 acres. Those 14 acres include the Warall farmhouse and the barn. And the second well." She sat down, not because she needed to, but because standing seemed suddenly effortful. "Why are you doing this?" she said. He straightened. He stood at the opposite side of the table with his hands flat on the surface, and he looked at the map rather than at her, and the silence that preceded his answer was long enough that she had time to notice the particular quality of afternoon light. Through the north-facing windows, the way it turned the survey map a pale gold. "My mother," he said carefully, "was a tenant farmer's daughter. She was married quietly, by a young man who believed himself to be free to marry her, and she was not told until much later that the marriage was being contested by his family, on the grounds that a prior understanding existed. When the contest was settled, she had a son of 8 years old and no legal status in the house she had kept and the lands she had helped manage." He paused. "She died of a winter fever when I was 12. She died as a dependent, not a wife, not a mother, not a woman who had given 9 years to a household that did not acknowledge her." Cecily did not move. "I have no power," he said, "to recover what was taken from her. I have some power in this particular circumstance to ensure that other people in analogous positions are not similarly stripped of what they are owed by instruments that have simply not been read carefully enough." She thought of Mrs. Patch and her children in the mill cottage. She thought of old Mrs. Danforth at the eastern edge of the estate. She thought of the Warall family, and their 14 acres and their barn and their second well. She thought of her father and his annotated sermons, and of the portrait at the end of the corridor, and of the young man of 21 who had looked at the painter with an expression that said he had declined to pretend. "Your mother would have been proud of you," she said. He looked up from the map. What was on his face was not what she expected. It was not the composed blankness he generally offered the world. It was something that had been waiting a long time to be said to him, and that it had finally been said was a thing his face had not yet decided how to absorb. He looked at the map again. His jaw was a line. "The Harrogate records," he said after a moment, "will require a formal affidavit from the county registrar to supersede the estate copy. I have already written to the office. The registrar's response is expected by Thursday." "Thursday," she said. "Yes!" She stood and reached past him to straighten the corner of the map that had come loose from its weight, and in doing so, she was briefly close enough to him that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold room, and the faint smell of the outdoors that clung to his coat, and the stillness with which he held himself as she reached. As though movement might change something he was not ready to have changed. She stepped back, smoothed her skirt, looked at the map. "Thursday," she said again. "Then I will write to Bertram's solicitor on Friday." He nodded. "Once precisely." She left him with the maps and went back to the morning room and sat for a while with her hands flat on the household accounts book and thought about what it meant to come home after 21 years and find someone standing in your library counting your books. The registrar's affidavit arrived on a Wednesday, not a Thursday. It arrived with a second letter, which was not from the registrar's office but from the solicitor's firm in London that represented Sir Bertram, and which informed Miss Ashford that he had decided to proceed with the sale of the principal estate, and that Miss Ashford would be expected to vacate the premises no later than the last day of December, and that Sir Bertram wished to express his appreciation for her service to the late baronet during his illness, and that a gratuity of £20 would be provided in acknowledgment of same £20. She read the letter at the writing table in the morning room, once quickly and then slowly, and then set it down and looked out the window at the kitchen garden, with the low stone wall and the bare orchard beyond it. She was still sitting there when Mrs. Holt knocked and said that Mr. Carow was asking whether she was available. "Why, tell him," she said, and her voice surprised her with its steadiness, "that I am not available at present." Mrs. Holt went. Cecily sat. She sat for longer than she had intended, and in that sitting she arrived at a series of understandings about her situation that she had been circling for weeks without landing on. She understood that £20 was an insult, dressed as generosity. She understood that she had no legal claim to any portion of the estate she had managed for 3 years. She understood that by December's end she would be without a home, and without a position, and with £20, and the kind of references that a woman in her circumstances could assemble, which were not nothing, but were also not, in the season of winter with the roads to the north closing enough. She was also, somewhere beneath all of this, furious. She had not permitted herself to be furious until now. Grief had taken up the space where fury would otherwise live, and practicality had taken up the space after grief, and dignity had taken up the space after practicality. Fury, she had decided somewhere in the autumn, was a luxury she could not afford. She was revising that assessment now. Fury, it turned out, had merely been waiting, and it was considerably larger than the space she had been keeping for it. She heard the door of the morning room open, and did not turn from the window. "I said I was not available," she said. "I know what you said." Carow's voice, level as it always was. She heard the door close behind him. The letter from Bertram's solicitor. Price mentioned it. She turned then because it was either turn or throw something, and she was not going to throw something. He was standing inside the door with his hat in his hands, turning it once by the brim, in the manner of a man who has very specific feelings about a situation and has decided with some difficulty not to act immediately on all of them. £20, she said. "I heard for 3 years of management. £20. "I heard," he said again, quietly. She sat down in the nearest chair, not gracefully, simply sat, because her legs had decided they were finished with the effort of being upright. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her. The 2 chairs that flanked the cold hearth without asking permission and without ceremony. He sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at her with an attention so direct and unguarded that she had to make a deliberate choice not to look away from it. "The affidavit arrived," he said. "The Worrall holding is confirmed at the larger boundary, 14 acres. Their tenancy is secured." He paused. "I intend to speak to Price today about the catalogue. There are 3 items currently listed as entailed property that I believe can be demonstrated to fall outside the entail. The annotated sermons are one of them." She looked at him. "They were a personal gift to your father from the late baronet," he said, "documented in the baronet's own letter of 1807, a copy of which I found in the estate correspondence files. Personal gifts are not entailed property. You may keep the sermons." She did not trust her voice. She pressed her lips together, and did not trust her voice. "The escritoire in the morning room was also a personal gift, from your father's mother to your father, on the occasion of his appointment as steward. The documentation for that is in the same correspondence file." She put her hand over her mouth. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. It arrived in the room like a key turning in a lock. The particular care with which he said it, the way it told her he had been deciding for some time whether to use it, and had now decided. "You are not what they think you are." She lowered her hand, pressed her palms flat on her knees. "I know that," she said. "I have always known that. The difficulty is that knowing it does not change what they can do." No, he said, it does not. Documentation changes what they can do. Witnesses change what they can do. A solicitor who has read the correct version of the estate instruments, rather than his partial summary of them, changes what they can do. She looked at him for a long moment, at the maps under his arm that he had brought, and she had not noticed, at the steadiness of his hands. "You are building me a case," she said. "I am building," he said carefully, "a complete and accurate record of the estate's legal status. What you do with it is your own affair." She understood then that he had been doing this since the first morning. Since the mill cottage. Since the kitchen garden and the south parcel and the Harrogate registry. He had come to this house carrying a debt collector's credentials, and he had been from the first hour quietly and methodically dismantling the assumptions of the men who sent him. He had found her in his library, and he had not left her in it alone. The meeting with Price happened that afternoon in the east drawing room, and it was not what Cecily had expected. She had expected Price to push back. He was a careful man, not an unkind one, but he was also Sir Bertram's agent, and agents serve their principals. What she had not anticipated was that Caro would lay the documentation on the table with the calm precision of a man who has spent 21 years preparing for exactly this conversation, and that Price would pick up each document in turn and read it and set it down, and then look at the ceiling for a long moment and then say, in a voice that was entirely absent of inflection, "I see." That was all he said at first. "I see." Then he said, "The personal gifts will need to be formally withdrawn from the catalogue." "Yes," said Caro. "And the Worrall boundary will need to be redrawn on all copies of the estate map." "Yes." "And the mill cottage," Price said, with the expression of a man arriving, not for the first time at a conclusion he had not sought, "was never yours to list." "No," said Caro. "It was not." Price looked at Cecily. His expression held something that was not exactly apology, but was adjacent to it. "Miss Ashford," he said, "I will be writing to Sir Bertram this evening to inform him of the corrections required to the catalogue. I will also be noting in my report that the estate's management over the past 3 years has been conducted with a competence and thoroughness that is, in my experience, not common." He paused. "I do not know what Sir Bertram will do with that assessment." "No," she said. "Nor do I." Price nodded, gathered his documents, and left the room. In the silence that followed, she became aware of the particular quality of the late afternoon light through the east-facing windows, the way it had turned from gold to the flatter silver of the November evening, and of the fact that Caro was still sitting at the table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on the door that had closed behind Price. "You knew him," she said. "Price before?" A pause. "He worked for my uncle's solicitor when I was a boy," Caro said. "He is a decent man, who serves whoever holds the authority. He does not question his instructions unless the instructions are demonstrably wrong." He paused. The instructions were demonstrably wrong. She sat across from him in the east drawing room with the silver evening coming through the windows, and thought about what it meant to come back to the place that had expelled you and find, in the machinery of that expulsion, the leverage to protect the people who needed protecting. "What happens to you," she said, "after Thursday?" "After the assessment is complete." He looked at her. The question hung between them, in the cooling room. "I had not," he said, "planned past Thursday." She thought of £20 and a letter of vacancy. She thought of the morning room and the cold hearth and the 2 chairs where they had sat earlier that day with the space between them, precisely measured. She thought of the mill cottage and the Worrall holding and the annotated sermons on the shelf, and of a man of 21 in a portrait who had looked at the painter with an expression that said he had declined to pretend. "I have been offered £20, she said carefully, "and a reference, and the use of the household carriage as far as Harrogate, which is, I think you will agree, not a great deal." "No," he said, "it is not." "I am also," she said, "in possession of 3 years of accounts and a comprehensive knowledge of an estate that is about to be sold to a buyer who will need someone to manage it." He looked at her with an attention she felt across the table. "I have some acquaintance," he said slowly, with the solicitor who represents the most likely buyer for an estate of this type and value, a Mr. Alderton of Leeds. Does Mr. Alderton's client have any use for a competent land agent with an intimate knowledge of the Yorkshire property records? The silence this time was different from the others. It was not the silence of a man withholding. It was the silence of a man taking very careful stock of exactly where he stood. I imagine, Caro said, that he might have considerable use for such a person. Then you should write to him, she said, before Thursday. He looked at her. What was on his face was not the composed neutrality she had been reading for 9 days. It was something younger and less armored, a thing that the 9 days had been building toward without her knowing it. She felt the weight of his attention in her sternum, a pressure that was not unpleasant, that was in fact the opposite of unpleasant in a way she did not have a word for in the language she had available. I will write to him tonight, he said. Then more quietly, he said her name. Cecily. She did not say his name back to him. Not yet. She held the room around them, the silver light and the cold hearth and the 2 chairs and the maps that had changed everything. And she let it be what it was, a beginning and not an ending, a threshold and not a closed door. He asked the following morning in the corridor outside the library whether she would walk with him to the northern boundary, as he wished to make a final notation on the survey before Price submitted it. She put on her heaviest cloak and her stout walking boots, and she walked with him. The ground was hard with the beginning of winter frost, the grass silver at the roots, the sky the particular pale white of November in the north of England. He walked at the proper distance, 2 feet of cold air between them, but she was aware of him with a completeness that made the cold air feel irrelevant, as though proximity had its own warmth that propriety could not entirely govern. At the northern boundary he took his measurements and made his notations. She looked out at the Worrall fields, the farmhouse visible in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney, and thought about what it meant to secure something for people who did not know it needed securing. You should know, he said, writing in his survey book, that Mr. Alderton has replied already. His client has an interest. She looked at him. In the estate, he added, still writing. Then, after a pause, he said, and in the situation as a whole. She understood from the care with which he said it that he was not speaking only of the estate. She had spent 3 months learning how to receive alarming information with her hands folded in her lap. She spent a moment now with her hands loose at her sides, feeling the cold through her gloves, and let his words settle into the place where they belonged. Then you should inform Mr. Alderton, she said, that the estate's manager is prepared to discuss terms. Once the current assessment is properly concluded, he finished his notation, closed his survey book, looked out at the Worrall fields, with her for a moment, the smoke rising against the pale sky. Yes, he said, I will tell him. They walked back to the house in the cold, the distance between them unchanged, every inch of it precisely felt. And when they came through the kitchen gate, she thought that she had never been more aware of a door closing behind her, or of what a doorway could mean. Price submitted his revised assessment on a Friday, 2 days after he had promised it. The revisions were substantial: the Worrall boundary, the mill cottage, the personal gifts withdrawn from the catalogue, a number of other small adjustments that Caro had identified and that Cecily, working through the household accounts a final time, had confirmed. Sir Bertram did not come himself. He wrote a letter, which Price read to Cecily in the east drawing-room, that expressed dissatisfaction with the extent of the revisions and questioned the competence of the assessors, and then, in the final paragraph, accepted the revised figures and authorized the sale to proceed. He did not revise the £20. She let that be what it was. Mr. Alderton's client, whose name was Mr. Gatt, Halford, a mill owner from Leeds with a considerable fortune and a recent decision to acquire a country property, purchased Keld Manor and its grounds in December, at a price that satisfied the principal debt and the accumulated interest, and left a remainder that was placed, per the revised instruments, in a properly constituted trust for the benefit of the occupying tenants whose holdings had been confirmed. Mrs. Petch and her children kept the mill cottage. The Worrell family kept their 14 acres, and their barn, and their second. Well, Mrs. Danforth at 81 settled quietly into the category of permanent resident, secured by an instrument that Caro had drafted and Halford's solicitor had ratified without significant argument. Cecily stayed at Keld, not as the steward's dependent, not as the previous occupant generously permitted to remain. She stayed as the estate's appointed manager, under a contract of employment that Caro had negotiated with Halford's solicitor in 3 letters over the course of 2 weeks, and that Halford himself, a brisk and practical man who wanted his investment to run well without requiring his personal attention, had signed and sent back with a note that said simply, "Tell Miss Ashford I expect monthly accounts, and she will have everything she needs to produce them." She told Stephen Caro this in the library, on the morning Price's men finally departed, in a house that was cold and quiet, and for the first time since September, fully hers to manage. He was looking at the shelves again. The annotated sermons were back in their place. The escritoire was in the morning room. The portrait at the end of the corridor would remain there, she had decided, because it was part of the house's history, and because she wanted it there. "He seems a sensible man," she said. "Halford. Yes, he knows what he does not know, which is the quality most useful in a new landowner." He paused, still looking at the shelves. He was interested to hear that the estate had been managed for 3 years by a woman of 24, with no formal appointment and no particular authority other than her own competence. "What did you tell him about that?" "I told him," Caro said, "that it was exactly the kind of management an estate like this one required." She stood beside him. At the shelves, not the careful 2 feet of cold air, the space between them was different. Now the particular closeness of 2 people who have been measuring the distance between themselves for 9 days and have arrived, without announcement, at a new accounting. He turned. She was looking up at him, at the face that had stopped composing itself so carefully around her in the last few days, that had begun incrementally to let her see what it held. "There is," he said, "a solicitor in Harrogate, who has asked me twice in the past year whether I intend to establish myself permanently in the county. I have not, until recently, had a reason to answer him." She held his gaze. "And now?" she said. He reached up and took down the volume of annotated sermons from the 3rd shelf, the one that had been her father's, the one whose margins had no white left in them, and held it for a moment as though recalling its weight. Then he placed it in her hands. "Now," he said, "I believe I have." She looked down at the book at her father's handwriting. In the margins, the thin, familiar script that she had been reading since she could read at all. She held it with both hands and felt the weight of it, which was not only the weight of the paper and the ink and the worn leather cover, the fire which Mrs. Blank Holt had laid that morning in the library grate had been burning long enough to warm the room properly. At last snow had begun against the north-facing windows. The first snow of the season, soft and unhurried. Somewhere below them in the house, she heard the kitchen door and the sound of the housekeeper moving through the rooms. She knew she did not say anything, neither did he. They stood together in the warm library with the snow falling outside, and she held the book her father had loved, and what had been lost and what had been found, and what was only now beginning settled around them like something that had been waiting for a very long time to arrive. If this story moved you, let it rest quietly for a moment before you go. It is glad you stayed.